In this video, I'm going to have a look at installing Linux Fedora 40 on a Dell Latitude 9420. So if I press Ctrl Shift and Escape to open up the device manager, I can have a look at its performance tab and see it's got an 11th generation processor, 16 gig of RAM, a 1 terabyte solid state drive, it's got an Intel Wi-Fi card, and it's got Intel graphics. And if I press Windows and R and type in msinfo32, I can get details about the system model and the BIOS version. So it's a Dell Latitude 9420, and we can see its BIOS version is from 2013, so probably needs to be updated. So let's go to Dell drivers and downloads and see if there's a newer BIOS version. So if I select the model, it's a Latitude 9000 series, 9420. And I want to select expand and then select BIOS. So I'm going to download the BIOS update, and I can see that it's a newer version than the current version installed. So now I'm going to download Fedora. So there's an option to create a bootable USB using the Fedora Media Writer. However, it shrinks the capacity of the USB flash drive. So I'm going to instead use the ISO and use Rufus to create a bootable USB. So I can go to the Rufus website to download Rufus. And I'm just going to download the latest version. And select close that advertisement. And now if I go to the downloads folder, I can launch Rufus, accept the user account control prompt, and then select the installation ISO and verify the checksum. So here we've got a AHCI 256, which we can copy. And if we go back to the Fedora download page, we can verify the checksum. So if we just open this file up in Notepad and press Ctrl and F, we can see that the checksum matches, and therefore the ISO has downloaded correctly. So next, I'm going to insert a USB flash drive. This is a 32 gigabyte one. You're probably going to want a 16 gigabyte USB flash drive or larger to create installation media. And next, you want to select the partition scheme as GPT. The file system should be FAT32. You want to write it in ISO mode, and then you want to select OK. So Rufus will create the GPT partition table with a single FAT32 partition, and then it's going to copy all the files from the installation ISO across over to this USB flash drive, creating the Fedora 40 bootable USB. I'm also going to copy the BIOS update to this USB because we can update the BIOS from the BIOS boot menu. So that's the Fedora 40 installation media created on Windows 11. Let's now create the installation media on Linux. So this system's already running Fedora 40, and I'm going to go ahead and create a bootable USB on Fedora 40. So once again, I'm going to download the installation ISO. So now I'm going to insert a USB flash drive, and one of the partitions on it is mounted. So I'm just going to right click this and select unmount. Now I'm going to launch the Fedora Media Writer, select the ISO file, select the USB flash drive and select write. So as mentioned, the Fedora Media Writer will shrink the USB flash drive. So essentially it's going to create a partition table with a single partition on it that's smaller than the capacity of the drive and is just large enough for the installation media. So the installation media will be created, and if you want to copy the BIOS update, you're going to have to do this on a separate USB flash drive. So insert the USB flash drive which contains the partition with the BIOS update, and then power up the Dell and press F12 to get to the BIOS boot menu. So here you see your BIOS revision and you've got the option for BIOS update. Select flash from file and then select the USB partition that has the BIOS update. So in this case, it's the Fedora USB created on Windows 11. And this has the BIOS update. So I can select it and select submit. And then because this is compatible, the update BIOS button is enabled, and I can select this and I can confirm the BIOS update. So it'll go ahead and flash the BIOS and update the system firmware. And the firmware is normally updated to support newer Linux kernels. So now I'm going to power up the Dell and press F2 to get to the UEFI BIOS setup. So we see we've got the latest BIOS version, and now we can see details about the system. So we've got the 11th generation Intel processor, 16 gigabytes of RAM, an Intel video controller and an Intel wireless device, and a Realtek audio controller. If the advanced setup is off, you're probably going to want to turn it on to get all the options. So we're going to need to select the storage tab, and the default storage controller operation is RAID on, which essentially means all the internal drives alongside the processor combine to create a single virtual drive. So for example, if you've got NVMe solid state cache drive known as Intel Optane, and you've got SATA hard drive, then these combine together to create a large capacity drive that has parts of it that are cached for increased performance. Now, even if you don't have an Intel Optane module and only a NVMe solid state drive, it's going to work together with the processor to improve the system performance. Unfortunately, the Linux kernel developers haven't deemed the rapid storage technology drivers or Intel VMD drivers stable enough to add them to the Linux kernel. So there's no Linux kernel VMD driver, and therefore we must use the AHCI/NVMe storage controller operation, which essentially means each storage controller on your system will act independently. So this means if you've got a hard drive installed, it's going to use AHCI, and if you've got an NVMe solid state drive, it's going to use NVMe, and the two drives will act independently, and you won't have the additional performances made by the processor. So now I'm going to go into the boot configuration and delete the old entries from the boot sequence, leaving only the USB flash drive. Then I can scroll down and see if secure boot is enabled. So it should be on by default and in deployed mode. Everything in the Fedora installation, including all the drivers in the Linux kernel, are signed, so they'll pass secure boot. Next, I'm going to have a look at integrated devices. So most of the integrated devices are enabled by default. I've also enabled the Thunderbolt boot support, so I can go in and screen record the BIOS. So I've got most of the default settings for the other tabs. So I'm just going to skim through the connection and the power. In the security tab, I've got most of the default options. So the TPM 2.0 is enabled. And in this tab is also the Dell data wipe. So I'm going to enable this and then select OK, and then select no at the question to cancel the operation. So when I reboot, Dell data wipe will be initialized and I can securely erase all the internal drives. So in the keyboard setting, I've got the option to change the way the function keys work, and I'm using the default option. Another setting you may want to change is in the Preboot Behaviour tab, and this is the fast boot setting. So the default setting is auto, which means the BIOS will decide whether to use a minimal most of the times or thorough boot. And when a minimal boot is used, then there's sometimes issues on Linux where wireless cards are essentially left in some sort of standby setting, and the Linux operating system doesn't recognize them and doesn't wake them up, so you don't get a wireless card, for example. So if you've got issues, you're going to want to change the setting from auto or minimal to thorough, and this should allow the wireless cards and everything to initialize correctly. So I'm going to use the default settings for virtualization support and the default performance settings. And then just for completeness, we've got the system logs, which essentially tells us details about the system. And then we've got the about, which tells us about the BIOS setup. So we can apply the changes and we can exit the BIOS setup. So now the computer will reboot, and because we have opted for Dell Data Wipe, we should be shown the Dell Data Wipe prompt. So we want to use the arrow keys to select continue and then press enter, and then we want to select erase, and then we want to select OK. So if you've got an NVMe solid state drive, it's going to be wiped in less than a minute because essentially everything on it's being wiped simultaneously, and it's got a faster access time. If you've got a hard drive attached to the SATA port, it's going to take a lot longer due to the slower write time and the fact that it's done sequentially. So it may take several hours, so just leave it overnight to perform the data wipe. So as you press OK, the computer will reboot, and you're going to want to press F12 to get to the BIOS boot menu, where you can select your bootable USB flash drive. Next, you're going to want to select the default option, which is Test and Media, and start Fedora Workstation live. So what you're essentially doing is using the USB flash drive as a drive for the operating system, and it's being run from the USB flash drive. So it's going to check all the background services, and then you're going to be taken into the USB flash drive live environment. So this isn't going to be as fast as it would be if it's installed on an internal solid state drive. So from the bootable USB flash drive, we can select this Welcome to Fedora and then install Fedora. So the first option is going to be the language settings, and then you can go in and select continue. So your localization settings are going to be automatically determined from the language setting that you just selected. However, if you want to change the keyboard or time and date, you can go ahead and change these. Now, it's not going to let you proceed with the installation until you go to installation destination. And actually in this case, my internal solid state drive, which is the only drive in this system, is selected by default. So notice when I click this, I actually unselect it. So I need to make sure that the tick is here, and then I'm just going to use automatic and select done. So now I can select begin installation, and the installation media will take a while to copy all the files to the internal solid state drive and install Fedora 40 and create the bootloader. Once it's done, you can select finish installation. So what this does is it actually just closes the installation wizard. You're still running Fedora 40 from the bootable USB live environment. And what you want to do is just go in and select power and select restart. So the Fedora installation on your internal drive will create a new boot entry, and this will take precedence over the Fedora bootable USB. And when your computer reboots, you'll be taken into the Fedora setup. So you'll see welcome to Fedora, and then you're going to be prompted to connect to a wireless network. So select your network, input your wireless password, and then select connect. So once you're connected to a network, you can just select next. And then you're going to be taken to the privacy settings. Normally I just leave these both on. And then you're going to be given the option to enable third-party repositories. So Fedora is made by Red Hat, and Red Hat have their own package management system called RPM, Red Hat Package Manager. And these are enabled by default only if they are published by Red Hat. If you select enable third-party repositories, it's going to enable third-party RPMs in addition to Flatpak, which is a community package management system, which is designed to be cross Linux distro. So you're generally going to want to enable the setting. In the next screen, you're going to want to input your full name and your username. Your username should be all lowercase with no special characters or spaces. Input a password and confirm the password, and then select done. Next, you're going to be taken to the welcome tour, so we can start the tour. So it tells you can get an overview by pressing the Windows key. So notice that the dock disappears when you're actually on a window. In order to show it, you need to press the Windows key. If you press the Windows key and begin to type, you're going to search for an application, for example, the text editor. Then you're going to be told details about workspaces. So notice that we can select a workspace to the right. And then we're going to be given details about touchpad gestures. So basically you can use 3 fingers to get an overview or get to a different workspace. So if I press the Windows key and select Show All Apps, I can open up Settings. And notice that I can snap this by dragging it to the left or dragging it to the right. Or I can make it full size by dragging it to the top. If I press the Windows key and open up another application, notice when I press the Windows key again that all the windows display and you can select the window that you want. So we can snap one to the left and one to the right. And if we press the Windows key, then we can see all open windows and select the window that we want to see. So let's have a look at settings, and I'm going to go to accessibility and always show the accessibility menu, which shows this person icon to the top right. And from here, I can enable the on-screen keyboard. So most of the settings are quite clearly laid out. And if I go to the System tab, you can see I've got software updates, and in Fedora, the software updates are integrated into software. So there's an updates tab to the right, and notice that the updates are grouped by essentially operating system updates and applications and firmware updates. So let's update the operating system and the applications. And then we're going to be prompted for a restart. And once we log back in, we can go ahead and proceed with the firmware updates. So let's select the first update. and then proceed with the restart. So the next updates listed are the firmware updates for the dock, and each component of the dock is separately listed. However, if we just select the dock update, it's going to update the dock and all the components on the dock. So we now get a dialog box telling us that the update will continue when we remove the USB cable. So just remove the USB cable, leave it for a couple of minutes, and then reseat it. So all the firmware entries for the dock are now removed because the dock is up to date. So if we go to the install tab, we see we've got a number of pre-installed packages, and if we go to Explorer, we can search for additional packages. So Fedora has easy to use File Explorer, and you can change some of the settings here, and it's got a simple terminal. So you've got your username at Fedora, then colon, and then the location the terminal is open in, and then you've got the prompt which you can begin to input some command. We've got a simple text editor, and the default browser is Firefox. There's a number of system utilities which are grouped together in the utilities folder. So if you press the print screen button, you're going to open GNOME Screenshot, and you've got the option to take a screenshot of a window, of the screen, or of a selection. And by default, the screenshots are saved under Pictures and then Screenshots. And if you open these up by default, you're going to open them with Image Viewer. So if I press print screen again, instead of taking a screenshot, I can record the screen. And to the top right is a timer that just shows the time of the screen recording. And we can press stop here to end the screen recording. And then if we go to the videos folder, we've got screencasts, and then we can open this in the default media player. Now, unfortunately, there's one major bug with the screen recording, and that is the mouse is not recorded, which makes it very limited to actually create tutorial videos such as this one. And you can see that this has been an issue for a while in this version of GNOME, alongside a few previous versions of GNOME. So hopefully it gets fixed soon, and it'll make the screen recording much more useful. So let's move on and have a look at the touchscreen user interface. So this is a 2-in-1 convertible. So by default, the touchscreen works well with Firefox, and I can scroll up and down and select things. Let's enable the touchscreen keyboard. And notice that I can drag the window to where I want it to, and when I go into the search bar, the on-screen keyboard displays as it should. So GNOME's got a pretty good touchscreen experience with apps that support the touchscreen keyboard. Notice that when it's in laptop mode, the screen's not going to auto-rotate. However, because this is a convertible, I can convert it into a tent. And when I do, it's essentially detected that it's in a tablet mode, and screen rotation is automatically carried out. So the touchscreen keyboard doesn't always invoke. It invokes most of the times. The user interface isn't seamless for touch though. but still it's a pretty good experience on a 2-in-1 convertible system. So if you've just came to Fedora from Windows, you may notice that your touchpad works slightly different to how you expect. So as the welcome tour, notice that we've got these 3-finger gestures, and what we can essentially do is use this to switch a window, and then we can basically drag this to the left or to the right, or we can maximize it depending on our preference. And if instead we use 3 fingers to go left or right, we can switch workspaces. So another thing that may trip you up is the concept of a left and a right click. So notice when I click here or click here, with 1 finger, I essentially always get a left click. And if I press down with 2, notice I get a right click. And there's also a 3-finger press, which is essentially copy and paste. So if I select some text and then press down with 3 fingers, it's going to copy it. And if I open up a new tab and press down 3 fingers, it's going to paste. So that's the default settings for the touchpad. However, we can change it if you prefer using the area click. So if I use 3 fingers to switch between all the applications, I can open up settings. And to the left, we've got the mouse and touchpad tab. And then we can select mouse at the top or touchpad. And the default settings is going to be 2-finger push. However, we can change this to corner push. So if I select this as corner push, then notice I can still use the 3-finger gestures. So for example, if I want to switch between applications, I can use the 3 fingers to get back to Firefox. And if I go to left, I get a left click. And if I go to the right, I get a right click with just a single press. So this may be the default behavior of your touchpad that you're used to, so you can change to this setting. So now let's have a look at docking the system. So I'm going to plug it into a WD-19 Thunderbolt and an external monitor. So the laptop's got a touchscreen which uses a high DPI scaling, and monitor just uses regular DPI scaling and is non-touch. So let me just change the order of the monitors, and I can use the mouse to go between the 2 monitors. And notice that this has got 100% scaling, and this has also got 100% scaling. So let me change this to 200%. And now the window displays correctly on both monitors. So a commonly installed browser on Linux is Chromium, which is the open source engine behind Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge. Now, although Chromium's open source, Google actually add additional functionality to it in Google Chrome, normally in the form of multimedia codecs. So if you're wanting to use streaming services, you may want to install Chrome as well. Now there's actually multiple versions of Chromium, And this is because there's two package managers used. There's Red Hat and there's FlatHub. So normally it doesn't really matter what package you install. Red Hat recommend preferencing the Red Hat package in Fedora, because they may make additional tweaks to it to improve system performance. However, such tweaks are generally just made to the Chromium project itself, and therefore will eventually make it into both packages. So if I compare Firefox with Chromium, notice that when I press into the search bar, the on-screen keyboard displays. On Chromium it doesn't, so Chromium's got a really good touch response, but pressing into a text entry field does not invoke the touchscreen keyboard. And because it's a problem with Chromium, and other packages such as Chrome and Edge and even VS Code are based on Chromium's engine, then a lot of applications will not invoke the touchscreen keyboard. And you can see that this is quite a common issue, and a lot of people have been complaining about it. And it's been an issue that's been there essentially for 4 years. So hopefully this gets addressed at source with the Chromium package itself. However, there have been some workarounds for previous versions of GNOME in the form of this improved on-screen keyboard extension. Unfortunately, this extension doesn't yet support the latest version of GNOME, so can't be used currently at the time of making this video. So that's a look at browsers. Let's now have a look at Office suites. So by default, OpenOffice is pre-installed. So this gives you Writer, Calc, and Impress, which are OpenOffice alternatives to Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. Now I actually prefer OnlyOffice desktop editors because it's got a much more similar user interface to Microsoft Office. So it doesn't quite have the full functionality of the Office suite, but it has essentially most of the things that are commonly used. And a lot of keyboard shortcuts within Microsoft Office will also work in OnlyOffice desktop editors. So the closest application I've found to Microsoft Paint is Drawing. There's a lot of Paint-like applications, but most of these are quite buggy, so I found Drawing to be the best one when you just, for example, want to quickly edit one of your screenshots just to crop it. And then you've got an equivalent to most of the buttons you see in Microsoft Paint, for example, to draw a line. And rotate, and I'm looking to draw a square, so I need to select the shape and then square, and then I'm going to draw a red square around this button. So the GNOME desktop environment can be modified using GNOME Tweaks. So these are essentially additional settings to the GNOME desktop environment. So Tweaks is found within Utilities, and when you open it, it gives details about extensions, which we'll have a look at next. So most of the mouse and keyboard settings have been migrated across to settings, and the kind of main settings here are the Windows settings. So notice that you can add the maximize and minimize button to the window. And I'm just going to leave everything at their default otherwise. And now let's have a look at extensions. So if we have a search for extensions, we've got this GNOME extensions, and this allows us to enable a limited number of extensions maintained by the GNOME developers. For example, we can add an application menu, or we can add the window list to the bottom. Places indicator. So this is essentially a quick way to get to File Explorer. And these extensions are maintained by GNOME and therefore are generally pretty stable, as they're tested by GNOME as they develop the GNOME desktop environment. Now we can also install Extension Manager, which can be used to install third-party extensions. So third-party extensions are normally tested for a major version of GNOME. However, if there's a minor update that changes something that the extension relies on, so the extension expects the old behavior, it may lead to instability in the desktop environment. So we can select Browse to browse through the extensions, and one of the most commonly installed extensions is Dash2Dock. So if we search for Dash2Dock and then select Install and then select Install again, then we can go to the Install tab and we can change the settings of the extension. Now this extension is pre-installed by Canonical in Ubuntu, and Ubuntu uses a modified GNOME desktop environment via this extension. So we can change its position on the screen to the left, and we can disable the auto hide, and that's essentially the behavior of Ubuntu. Now, many users coming from Windows prefer it to be at the bottom, and therefore they will also want to move the application icons to the start of the dock, and this is more similar to Windows. There are some additional options for multiple monitors, such as showing the dock on all monitors and isolating the applications on the monitors and also on the workspaces. And then there are also some additional color customizations. So using the built-in theme doesn't change anything on Fedora. However, we can customize the color. So for example, if we just want it to be blue, we can change it using this setting. Now, if you select white, you're likely not going to see the application button because it's white, so something grey is pretty nice. I'm just going to use the default. So another commonly installed extension is desktop icons. So if I just go to browse and search for desktop icons, new generation, I can install this desktop icons extension. And if you go to settings, you can change some of the settings for the desktop. For example, the personal folder and the trash icon. So we can also install a Clipboard extension. So if I install this Clipboard history, this will allow me to copy and paste multiple things, and everything I copy is going to display in the Clipboard history. And I can use this to select what I want to copy and paste. So another extension I'm going to install is just the Show Desktop button. And this will allow me to minimize all windows to get to the desktop. So the GNOME desktop environment uses basic window snapping, and in order to improve this, we can install the tiling assistant. So notice that I can now snap to quarters, and when I snap to a half, I can see all the other windows that I can snap to the other half. So this just makes it a bit more convenient. So additional window layouts can be created using GTile. So let's go ahead and install this. So notice that we can essentially select from this 8x6 grid how big we want this window to be. And let's just open up a lot of windows and test this out. So let's go 4x4 and let's reposition a window to the center of the screen. So I've docked my system to twin monitors, and now I'm using GNOME's screen recorder to perform a screen recording across both monitors. So once again, the mouse isn't being recorded. However, I'm just testing the GNOME desktop environment with these extensions, and I can see that they work pretty nicely across both monitors. So for example, if I want to do quarter tiling across both monitors, it works pretty seamlessly. So with this setup, both monitors have an All Applications button. And when you press this, the task switcher shows on the left and all applications show on the right. So I've noticed if I open an application up on the right, it's going to display on the right. However, if I open it up on the right and quickly move the mouse to the left, then it's going to open on the left monitor. So the desktop environment seems to work pretty smoothly across this multi-monitor configuration. So the Linux kernel essentially contains signed stable drivers only, and most of the hardware on my system works out of the box using these drivers. Now in my case, the webcam wasn't found, and that's because it doesn't have a driver installed. So in order to install the drivers, I need to use an unsigned experimental driver, and this is available in RPM Fusion, which contains additional unsigned experimental drivers. In the past, RPM Fusion was required to install drivers for NVIDIA graphics cards. However, NVIDIA have been contributing directly to the Linux kernel, and the Linux kernel now contains signed NVIDIA drivers which work out of the box. So use of RPM Fusion is becoming less prevalent because there's more and more hardware being natively supported by Linux. So because the drivers in RPM Fusion are unsigned, in order for them to work properly, we need to disable Secure Boot. So I'll power up my Dell and press F2 to get to the BIOS setup. And then I'm going to go to boot configuration and disable Secure Boot, and then apply the changes and exit. So RPM Fusion has free and non-free repositories. Now both are free for you to use as an end user. However, the free repositories are essentially open source, and the non-free are essentially closed source, which means they've been packages that are made by developers that use obfuscated code. So Linux kernel developers can't go in and modify things and tweak things, so they work optimally for the Linux kernel. So this is essentially closed source drivers and also closed source codecs. So you basically want to download the package and launch it, and this opens it in software, and you can go ahead and install the package. Next, we need to use the command line setup. So we want to just open up the terminal and paste the command. And then because we are making changes, we prefix the command with sudo, which is superuser_do. And you can think of this as the Windows equivalent for a user account control prompt. Instead of getting the prompt, we need to input our password in order to proceed. So we just need to follow all the additional instructions related to Fedora. And now that RPM Fusion is installed, we can go ahead and install the testing driver for the camera. So let's just test this configuration first, and we can see that there's no camera found because it doesn't have a driver. So first of all, we just want to make sure the free, non-free and experimental repositories are up to date. And then we want to install this experimental driver. So now that the driver has installed, I'm going to reboot. So unfortunately, when I reboot, my multimedia codec experiences an issue, and applications such as a webcam relies on the multimedia codec. So even though the driver is installed in this case, it's not going to be able to record from the webcam because there's an issue with the multimedia codec. So let me just test the camera anyway. So now we can see that the camera is detected, but because there's an issue with the multimedia codec, the frames per second are now 0. So we've got a camera driver installed, but we can't use the multimedia codec in order to access the footage from the webcam. So this system also has a fingerprint sensor, and if I go to System, Users and Philip and then Show All Options, I don't see any mention of the fingerprint sensor, and this is probably because this fingerprint sensor doesn't have a driver for Linux either. Now if I go to System Updates, I can see that there's an update for the multimedia codec, so this might help out with the camera. And if I go to updates again, I've got additional system updates and an update for the camera app. So given that these applications are getting updates, there's likely multiple issues that are having to be addressed here. After restarting my system and logging back in, I was still unable to use the camera app. So the driver is installed, but it's unable to stream from the camera.